Hi everybody and welcome to today's event, The Big Disconnect, SaaS Apps and Data Protection. I'm Stephen Manley, Chief Technologist here at Druva, and with me is ESG's best senior analyst, Christophe Bertrand.
Glad to be here. Thank you for the introduction.
Oh, thank you for being here. This is great. I know you guys just did a really big survey and there was a lot of interesting information in that. The first thing that really struck me was, you talk about the disconnect between the SaaS applications and people going for SaaS applications like Office 365 and you're not really protecting it. Why is that? Why are people missing this step?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, first of all, let's look at the facts. About a third of them say, hey, look, I don't back up 365, or I don't back up my SaaS apps. And then there's a big third or a half, depending on the application you're looking at, that say, well, I use the native tools. And of course, we know there are very few native tools, if any, that
Right.
you would actually want to use for backup and recovery. So therein lies the interesting fact, which is, okay, people don't really protect SaaS environments. Now, some of them do, by the way,
Right.
which is good news. So, but the question that you're asking me is why? And frankly, I'm not 100% sure, but I think there may be a confusion that they don't need to, because they may think that it's covered by the service. They're thinking, well, look, now it's off premises, it's in the cloud, it's their job. I've just pawned that off and it's great, let's just roll and I don't have to worry about it. It could also be that what was protected on premises by a certain part of the organization in IT, the data protection people, well, all of a sudden they see this going to the cloud, and maybe it's going to the cloud through other parts of IT. So maybe it's through a division or a non-IT decision maker. Maybe it is through IT operations because they sort of manage the cloud stuff. And maybe these people don't understand that it's not included in the SLAs.
So that brings up an interesting question then, because certainly as someone who's been in the data protection space for a long time, you kind of learn to not trust things, right, and to make sure you're safe. And if you don't have that background, I could see where people would make that assumption that, it's going to be fine. But you bring up the SLAs, and one of the interesting things in the data was that actually the people who best knew their SLAs were the ones who were most likely to just trust the vendor. But then you also pointed out that those SLAs seem to focus more on availability than on kind of traditional backup and recovery. So as you look at that, how do you reconcile knowing the SLA and yet not putting in some technology to make sure that you're fully protected?
Look, the only answer I can give you is if you know the SLAs, and the SLAs do not specifically state, I will back up your data for X amount of retention in some whatever condition there is, then you don't have backup and recovery SLA, just face it. And I doubt that anybody has. There is maybe a data retention period, and that could be where people get confused, where, hey, we'll retain your data for X amount of time, or for an extra price, we could potentially give you a recovery copy provided certain things are met. And those will not meet RPOs and RTOs of most modern enterprises. Now, again, the services really work on the basis of them being available almost all the time. And that's really what's in the SLA, and providing great protection against potentially ransomware or cyber attacks, because they have a very hardened security type of environment or infrastructure. So there are a bunch of SLAs around that for sure. But when it comes to backup and recovery, typically that's not covered. So I think there's a big disconnect there. The other thing is, at the end of the day, it's always your data.
Right.
Nobody else's. And not just for backup and recovery, which is really an operational question, but also for legal reasons, for compliance. It's your data. And someone in legal, someone who's auditing your infrastructure for compliance reasons will need to know where the data is and what security it has and how recoverable it is. And that's not going to change. So you're always responsible for your data. I think people have just somehow forgotten that. I feel like, I don't know, they went on a cruise and it's a big vacation and, we don't need to back up anymore now. Let's go have another cocktail. Well, no, that's not the case.
Right.
You're responsible for your data.
Oh, and so that compliance point is interesting then, because if you are responsible for your data and eventually auditors or someone will come by, Do you imagine that there will come a point where we'll start to see sort of this wave of audits that are going to start calling people out and saying, you're not compliant right now?
It's already started through other mechanisms, of course, associated with the new wave of privacy regulations. GDPR is a big one, which actually is a very interesting regulation in that it really covers a lot of IT-related questions, but its primary intent is to protect individuals' data. So at the same time, it's the protection as in not making it available to people who shouldn't have it, sometimes deleting it, but sometimes keeping it. So good luck with that, right? The same is happening in California with the CCPA regulations coming online on January 1st, 2020. So, and here again, you're going to have to be able to demonstrate you're doing certain things with the data or not. At the end of the day, it's about understanding that the data is protected, how it's accessed, etc. So there is definitely a correlation between backup and recovery and compliance. If you don't back up and recover, it's all in the cloud and it goes away. Well, for sure, you're not going to be compliant because all these regulations have a data protection mandate for sure.
So now I want to pivot a little bit, right? Because we've sort of talked about, okay, why aren't people getting protected? Let's go positive. Let's be optimistic. As you point out in the survey, a third of people are using third-party applications to back up, and they are getting better recovery statistics. So what's the characteristics of those organizations? What is it that's making them successful? Why have they chosen a third-party backup, and how could others sort of follow in their footsteps?
Yeah, I think it goes back to best practices, better enforcement of best practices, maybe earlier adopters that I've actually experienced some issues, organizations that really go through a thorough audit of their processes for any application. So I think all of these reasons, that culture of backup and recovery being stronger than in other places. I think also maybe having decision makers, and again, I don't have a specific data point on this, but I'm guessing with a high level of confidence that it's organizations that have probably a good sort of centralized decision-making power around protection of data and whether it's on-premise or in a cloud. I would say the other thing that could be happening is there are some solutions out there, some early solutions, early adopters of those backup and recovery solutions, and they have influenced, the vendors have influenced the end users to actually get it done. The other final point, not to be negative, but it happens, services become unavailable. There have been issues with every vendor, and again, I'm not saying it will happen again, but it's probable it will happen for all sorts of reasons. And the minute you become unavailable, you feel you can't access that email or that application, whatever the case may be, all of a sudden you start thinking, well, okay, how do I recover it? Where's my backup? And I think some of that is also creating maybe a higher frequency of realization amongst people, and then the acquisition of third-party backup solutions.
That makes sense, and I agree with you. You never want to sort of point to the bad thing happens and now we think about backup and recovery, but the truth is that's how our industry's always been, right? Is one of the forcing functions to make people think is something bad happens either to me or to somebody else, and first thing I think is, well, okay, how do we make sure that isn't us next time? So right. I buy into that. So let's say you're in one of these organizations and maybe you come from a backup background or you're aware that bad things could happen. What might you recommend to them to try to help bring attention at the broader level in the organization so that they could get funding and do the right thing in these areas?
Yeah, I guess it kind of depends where the application resides and who's owning it. Sometimes you have to go to the business decision makers and say, look, we've done this for you. We've now migrated to a SaaS service for your part of the business or your function. Here's the part that you really need to worry about. I think in other cases, it's going to maybe a chief security officer and say, hey, are we sure we can really pass those audits and have we really ensured that we can do everything? And sometimes, again, data protection compliance is never too far off. And more importantly, it's just going back to the mission criticality of the application and having a review, and a lot of organizations and enterprises have a review with management and the business side on mission criticality of applications, on ranking them, on thinking about those service levels, the platinum, the gold, the bronze, whatever the levels are. So these are practices that I've seen and heard about certainly for many, many years, and they now apply more and more. I think it's as simple as having that conversation and asking, hey, what's our what's our service level policy for this application? Oh, it's in the cloud. We shouldn't worry. Well, hang on. It's not in the SLA, is it?
Right.
What can we do? Now, you see the logic here is exactly what is not happening in many organizations today, in my opinion. It's starting to change, and I think many vendors will help with that realization.
And for me, I think one of the things I like about sort of your answer and where that goes is, I mean, a lot of IT professionals who ask me, as things go more towards cloud, everybody worries a little bit about what happens to my job, what happens to my role in the organization. And the number one thing that I always tell them is, the more that you can map the technology to either the business or to security or compliance or something that matters at a higher level, the more relevant you become and the more you're going to see your career advance, because knowing technology is key, but 10 years from now, there aren't going to be as many roles in just managing technology. You've got to be able to connect it to the business. So this could be a good first step for somebody to start elevating their profile in a company.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. The other thing is there's only going to be more data, and where there is data and where there's mission criticality, there is data protection.
Right.
Like it or not, that's the reality. Now, there may be a realization that needs to happen. I will also say one more thing. In our research, we typically look at the age of the organization, not the age of the respondent necessarily.
That'd be illegal.
The age. Well, we do that too, but the age of the organization, just to get a sense for, okay, we're dealing with what we call a digital native organization, company that's 10 years or younger, or 50 plus, and anywhere in the middle. Because of course what happens is that those organizations have a very different adoption of technology or pace of adoption of technology. Think about a 50 plus year old organization, they've known mainframes. Right? And think about a digital native organization, well, by definition, by the term I just gave them, you realize it's everything cloud first, and cloud is good. So these organizations, as a matter of fact, when it comes to trusting SaaS and backup and recovery, they will trust SaaS environments more, or cloud environments more, than the older organizations culturally. And that could lead to maybe a little bit of them getting ahead of their skis at times. So there's some of that going on as well. That has to be, I think, remembered as you go through why people are doing things or not doing things. There's a cultural aspect to it.
And I think that ties back to what we were talking about at the beginning, which is those organizations that have, frankly, lived through some of the scars that have happened. Because, like you point out, there's lots of reasons that people lose data and need to recover it. It could be, human accident. It could be application error. The logical corruption.
Right.
One that I'm seeing increasingly, and I'd be curious your take on this, is kind of malicious actors inside an organization. So there's a number of companies I've met with that have told me, we actually are worried about employees who get disgruntled or contractors that get disgruntled. And as they walk out the door, they blow away large percentages of our applications. And so, again, if I trust my SaaS administrator and everything's under that person, that leaves me really exposed, whereas they think of it as, if I can have a second administrator who's got the backup, who is separate, now the blast radius of any one individual is a lot less than it used to be.
Absolutely. I mean, malicious activity for, whether for profit or just because somebody's disgruntled. Not that I have ever seen a gruntled employee, is certainly a big issue. And the thing is, with those SaaS applications, the minute you start deleting, especially the more sort of semi-structured type of environments, database-like-ish environments, you start deleting a bunch of fields or whatever the case may be, automate some of that, well, it's gone. I mean, the undos don't always work or are not even available. And remember, it's a SaaS environment. You're not going to do a snapshot and freeze a SaaS environment. You're sort of sharing that resource with everybody else who's using the service. So that limits the way and the methodologies you can traditionally use. That's why you have to go to new ways of protecting the data. And to your point, whether it's an individual or, again, some other issue, but you make a good point about the SaaS administrator. Well, let's have somebody else run the backups and have the backups so something come up, you can rebuild your infrastructure in the SaaS environment, rebuild the data, rebuild your profiles, whatever it is that you're doing and what type of data it is. But it's going to be the same across the board. You're still going to have that responsibility somewhere in the organization. And of course, access controls and who can do what with what, whether backup or just administration of an application, is going to be key.
Now, one of the other things that, and there was a line someone once gave me that was interesting, and they said, backup is potentially the only application that was ever truly heterogeneous in your environment, in the sense that there aren't many things that worked across Unix and Windows and multiple database vendors and all these different tools. And yet, right now in the SaaS environment, it feels a little bit like, we're trying to abandon that heterogeneity, and we're saying, well, no, Office 365 protects Office 365, Salesforce protects Salesforce, Slack protects Slack. Do you see a world where we go back to understanding that kind of heterogeneous protection is actually a good thing?
Yeah, actually, that's it's already started, because what you said is not true. They don't protect
Right.
their own
Good point.
except for the provision of their own service and availability. Now, some of these vendors may offer in time a backup service or an archival service. There are some modules. You mentioned 365, very complex environment, which also has other limitations associated with governor limits and how many calls you can make to an API to actually do things. 365, of course, is very pervasive, probably the most important application today, or SaaS application to protect today. So I think in time you're going to see more of a specialization in terms of, I want the best engine for this application or that application. They're all different. They have different APIs. Or lack thereof, there are different ways of protecting those environments, just like you could see for Unix or Windows, or it doesn't matter what, right? Or specific apps on premises. So what I think this will do is it will force vendors such as yourself to really find the best feature set, but also the best way to provide a unified, heterogeneous management above that, because you want the best engine for the task. However, you still want to maintain that flexibility and an ease of use for the end user. You don't have the luxury now of having that PhD of backup, running backup and recovery. So now it's going to be an IT generalist and maybe someone who wants to have that sort of iPhone experience, because that's what everybody expects these days. So I think it gives you a great opportunity as a vendor to really think about building that ease of use across a broader spectrum now of solutions. And by the way, not everything will be in the cloud. There will still be some things that will be on premises or in private clouds. And what cloud is also an interesting definition. So I would just say your heterogeneous comment applies even more moving forward, but we're in a transitional phase right now. Right. And I think that's what we've uncovered with the research.
Yeah. No, and I think that does tie in with exactly where we want to go as a company, that no matter where your data is, no matter how you created it, we'll protect it, we'll get it in one place. And to your point, the whole point of SaaS in general, whether it's our SaaS data protection or it's a SaaS application like Office 365, the goal was always to take the complicated infrastructure work that no one wants to do, and let's go solve that for you so you don't need the PhD, so that you could just get the value that you need out of it, whether it's I need compliance reports, or I need my data recovered, or I need to be able to search and analyze what's going on.
Right.
And yeah, very much I see that's our future, is pulling all that information together and doing it in a way that you don't need the PhD in backup anymore, because I checked recently, and most of the big universities don't do the PhDs in backup these days.
They don't for sure. I will tell you that, of course, once you've done all of that, the benefit is that you can now start thinking about how you better leverage the data. And we have other research that just came out around what I call intelligent data management, which is how do you sort of cross that chasm between sort of dumb data backup to, well, now I want to do data reuse intelligently so I can do other things with it. Compliance is, of course, a big thing, but analytics and test dev, DevOps, et cetera, et cetera. So, of course, cloud environments and infrastructures help with that, but you're right about one thing. Backup is very heterogeneous across the organization. There are only two big Uber processes that I can think of in IT that actually scan all of the data, or should.
Right.
Well, cyber-related type of technologies, and backup and recovery. So there you go.
I agree. And I like to tell people sometimes when they say, well, why would I want to do SaaS backup? I think it is very much, well, wouldn't you want all of your data next to the by far most powerful compute, machine learning, AI infrastructure the world has ever known? Why wouldn't you want that? Right. Think of what you could do.